This century has been paradoxical. There's been huge scientific and technical progress, but so many lives were lost in wars. It's also been a time of ever greater speed. The great ocean liners were a symbol, at least until the late 50s, of a certain art of living and represented a nation's prestige. After the Île-de-France in 1926, the French line launched the Normandy. 313 meters of absolute elegance. Her shape and size were sheer poetry, and her 3 funnels were perfectly proportioned. The overall effect was of immense power. The interior was designed by the greatest artists of the day and is just as stunning. The dining hall, 86 meters long and 8.50 meters high, is as spacious as the Hall of Mirrors in the Versailles Palace. She's not only luxurious, she's fast too. When the Normandy arrived in New York in May 1935, the famous blue ribbon was flying from the top of the great mast. 4 days, 3 hours and 14 minutes, record for the crossing of the North Atlantic. The people of New York gathered along the banks of the Hudson and gave an ecstatic welcome to the most beautiful ship in the world. The Normandy was destroyed by a fire in 1942 in the port of New York, and it wasn't until May 11, 1960 that her successor came along. General de Gaulle describes the latest of the French line's ships thus: "The ocean liner France has now put to sea," as she slowly left the slipway number 1 where the Normandy had once been built. When the greatest ocean liner in the world, as she was called, embarked on her first transatlantic voyage on February 3, 1962, it was already too late. Airplanes were already the best and fastest way of crossing the North Atlantic. In 1974, the golden age of ocean liners and the France came to an end. The age of the cruise and the Norway could begin. The France was bought on June 25, 1979 for 77 million francs by the Norwegian shipowner Knut. Having been abandoned for 4 years, the France became the Norway.
Away from us. Mostly it's going the same way.
The Norway was overhauled and refitted from top to bottom and became one of the symbols of cruises to the Caribbean. For the first time since May 1974, the ship's long hull slipped through the waters of the Mediterranean, bringing back memories of her youth 25 years before. This cruise was a double voyage. First of all, a tourist trip to discover Villefranche-sur-Mer, Barcelona, and Lisbon with their rich maritime past. And secondly, an archaeological search for the remains of the old France, whose ghost is said to still haunt the gangways of the Norway. On the first morning, we arrive at Villefranche-sur-Mer. The Norway slowly enters one of the most beautiful harbors in the world. Villefranche Harbor, which is 150 meters deep in places, was for centuries the envy of the kings of Sardinia, who established a port there for their galleys in the 18th century. Later, the American squadrons moved in at the end of World War II and stayed there until 1962. Despite drawing 10.5 meters of water, the Norway casts anchor quite safely. The children in these small boats that have gathered to meet the Norway are in awe of her sleek bows that cut through the water like a knife through butter.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bay of Villefranche.
In the days when members of the bourgeoisie traveled on the first great liners, the French Riviera grew immensely in popularity. The automobile was invented and roads were built, which meant that certain parts of the coast which were previously inaccessible could now be reached. Leopold II, Princess Helen of Serbia, and many other royal figures came to Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat. Europe's elite built sumptuous palaces here. The Villa Ephrussi, Rothschild, is one of the finest examples. In grounds of 7 hectares, Beatrice de Rothschild, a collector and philanthropist, had a small Venetian-style palace built, surrounded by 7 themed gardens reminiscent of Italy, Spain, Japan, and so on. At that time, cosmopolitan eclectic styles of architecture sprang up on the Riviera, reflecting the whims of this immensely rich group of people who traveled widely and had a passion for past civilizations. From the gardens, the guests of Beatrice de Rothschild had a spectacular view of the Bay of Villefranche. They could see celebrities' yachts as well as military squadrons mooring in the harbor basin, which has long been famous for its shipyards.
What is the story of this boat you're restoring?
It
was built in 1926 by Camper Nicholson, an English firm. It was left abandoned for about 10 years. But in 1993, it was put on a historical register. Apparently, Lieutenant Lawrence of Arabia had it built. Then the actor who played him in the film wanted to buy it. Then came Dutch and English owners, and now it belongs to a Frenchman, a former teacher of geography. Villefranche's shipyards have a good reputation. Just there you have a Camper Nicholson boat, the Bystander, one of the last boats built by Sir Lipton. He used it as an office and for stopovers when he was at regattas or at the America's Cup races.
Why is this tradition so strong in Villefranche?
It's always existed. Look at how things were in 1388, when the Dukes of Savoy started to build boats and galleys and have them maintained and restored.
And why do you do it?
I love working on boats, working with wood, exotic wood, teak, mahogany, the varnish. The smell of the wood is amazing. I can't get on a plastic boat. I hate the smell.
In the 16th century, cruises for rich sailors in the Mediterranean were not then a reality. Barbarossa came from Algiers to attack the coast and even set up a base in Villefranche in 1543, forcing Philip, Duke of Savoy, to fortify the harbor basin. In the Middle Ages, the people of Villefranche took steps to protect their town. Certain streets were completely covered, such as the Rue Obscure or Dark Street, which was intended as a refuge for the population in case of attack. The buildings have been tastefully renovated and the locals have thankfully not been replaced by souvenir shops. Life goes on as always in the shaded alleyways of the old quarter, which remains a peaceful place for people to go walking. In Villefranche there was also the naval dockyard of the galleys of the King of Sardinia. Until the 16th century, most of the sailors on board the galleys were not slaves, but free men, taken on for their rowing skills. But soon the need for powerful fleets led thousands of unfortunate individuals into slavery, just for the theft of a piece of bread.
The Christ of the galley slaves was polychrome. The paint had been damaged, worn off, chipped over the past 3 or 4 centuries. It was thanks to Cocteau that it was renovated and stripped down completely. All our churches had a recumbent Christ statue that was often carried on Good Friday processions. If I had been a priest of Villefranche in those days, I'd have shown a great interest in those galley slaves, because they were so unfortunate.
Before we leave Villefranche, let's go to the port where traditional fishing techniques are still used and where the Nissard dialect, a variety of Provençal, is still spoken.
Mais c'est vrai que tu as fait un trou? Tu as fait un autre filet, tu as fait encore un? Il faut en faire un par semaine au moins.
Aujourd'hui c'est un peu maigre. Ouais. Ben, les variétés de poissons c'est par période.
The catch depends on the season, which starts in March. You catch sea bream, whitefish, mackerel, and then a little bit later in the season, scorpionfish and mullet. We work as a family. I'm the 3rd generation. I started with my father. My mother sold the fish and repaired the nets. And when I married, my wife began to sell the fish.
I hated school. I started during the vacation. Pa said, she's old enough to do her share now.
We're part
of the scenery. We're a feature of local folklore, and that's what I like about my life, a certain quality.
Does it bother you?
Not at all. I love it.
Back on board the Norway, we now embark on the next stage of our journey, a journey through time. In places like a wreck coming to the surface, the old France becomes visible under the new skin of the Norway. The Windward restaurant, now open to all the passengers, has replaced the old Chambord dining hall, which was for first-class passengers only in the days of the France. The wall decorations, lacquered aluminum plates illustrating the themes of life's pleasures, are intact.
What was this dining hall look like in the days of the France?
It hasn't changed much really. Just some new furniture. The ceiling has changed a bit. The dome is the same, but those illuminated stars weren't there. This dining room was the most exclusive. This is where the captain received his guests. The first-class passengers and the world celebrities dined here too. This was the place to be seen, especially at the captain's table. That was the high point of the crossing. If you'd been at the captain's table, you were treated with great respect.
The modern cruise has retained a certain sense of protocol from the days of the great ocean liners. Smiling Captain Geir Loken is only too pleased to submit to the tradition. As the cruise begins, he greets every passenger on board. The lounge, built on 2 decks and stretching the whole width of the ship, is the old first-class smoking room of the France. Although it's been entirely redecorated, this room has not lost any of its former elegance. Without resorting to the clothes of the great fashion houses, as was often the case in the past, the passengers of the Norway clearly take great pleasure in dressing up, especially for the captain's evening. This event is held one deck below in the North Cape Lounge, which takes up part of the huge Saint-Tropez Lounge, once reserved for the tourist class. One of the big changes when the France became the Norway was that the different classes disappeared. Various parts were adapted to cater for different, more lucrative activities, such as the casino, an essential part of any modern American cruise. After cocktails, the passengers are invited to take their seats under the restaurant's twinkling domed roof for the gala dinner. All eyes are on the captain and his guests as they proceed down the 19 steps of the Great Stairs, just like in days of yore.
On the packed leisure agenda, the nightlife comes high on the list. Every night, everyone dresses up to dine in the great dining hall.
During the night, the Norway heads west towards Barcelona.
I believe that the history of the France is forming the Norway too, because the French, to be honest, has made the Norway famous too. But I mean, when it comes, for me personally, when it comes to the ship, the France, I started as a little boy, reading about the ship. Because I had, a dream, actually, from when I was a little boy, to become a captain of the ship.
In 1980, the Norway went to the shipyards of Bremerhaven in Germany for a series of transformations. The interior was converted to take into account the fact there's now only one class, and the rear decks were extended to their current surface area of 6,000 square meters. The transatlantic liner became a cruise ship for the American market in the Caribbean.
What do I like best on the Norway?
The food.
Yes, that's right, the food.
The food.
Behind them.
30 years after the start of her second life, and despite two major overhauls, the second in 1987 considerably changing its look, the legend of the France is still apparent, sometimes in places you'd least expect it.
You know why we find such painting here?
Yes, because he's a very famous artist, Jean Mercier. We tell the kids every week.
Yeah?
What he used to do the menus, and we always tell the kids it's a terrific painting. And it was done in 1961, and it was the artist who used to also do the SS France menus that he hand painted.
This Noah's Ark and the colors of the France, designed by Jean Mercier, decorated the games room for children in the tourist class. Although video games have replaced the daily Punch and Judy shows, most of the activities on offer in the 60s to the passengers of the France are still available on board most cruise ships. At least, more or less are. In the early morning, the Norway enters the port of Barcelona. The towers of the Cathedral of the Sagrada Familia rise above the mist that still cloaks the city. Barcelona, once an important seaport, gradually turned its back on the sea. Thanks to the Olympic Games, which brought about the modernization of the seafront, the town attracts more and more cruise ships. Barcelona is one of the most lovely and most lively cultural capitals in Europe. We start at the monument to Christopher Columbus and walk up to the Rambla, an avenue, or rather a series of avenues, which stretch through the heart of the city.
Please, can you tell us the story of the Rambla?
The shops have been here since 1853 and even earlier, but 1853 is the official date. There were only 9 florists at first. They set up their stalls by the city walls, near the convents. This market's one of the largest in Europe. Barcelona has some amazing avenues, but they only look good for a few hours a day. The Rambla looks good 24 hours a day. It's a privilege to work here. If you visit Barcelona, you must come here. It's like the Eiffel Tower in Paris or the Colosseum in Italy. You simply must come here.
Let us leave the bustling Rambla behind us for a moment and head off into the quiet alleyways of the Barri Gòtic, Barcelona's medieval quarter. Even more than the Gothic style, the most striking architecture in Barcelona is modernist. Catalan architects and decorators embarked upon a wide-scale renewal of the shapes and colors of the city. The mosaists and ceramists, as well as other artists, added their work too. Together they invented a new approach which can still be seen today on the fronts of houses and in the back rooms of restaurants. Alongside these anonymous masterpieces, there are more famous ones by Montaner and of course Gaudi, with his unfinished but nonetheless breathtaking church of the Sagrada Familia. The Rambla also reminds us that Barcelona is also the town of Picasso and Miro, whose colorful excesses may be seen when you least expect them. The effervescent surrealist city of Barcelona is a continual surprise. Every step you take on the Rambla leads you to new forms of creativity.
The Rambla has everything. Absolutely everything.
It's unique.
It's like home. The people here are like family.
Around here, if we're dressed like this, no one cares. But in the Paseo de Gracia, or in nearly any other part of the city, they might throw stones at us.
A stone's throw away from the turbulence of the Rambla is the Plaza Real, whose strict Napoleonic architecture is a complete contrast to the extravagance of the modernist style. In the basement of a building on the square, we enter a world of carefully ordered boxes and precisely labeled glass jars. The alchemist weighs, mixes, and cuts up herbs from all over the world.
Before the advent of democracy, Barcelona had its back to the sea. But with the Olympic Games, the port and the town became more alive. In around 1945, the herb mate was discovered. Sailors brought it back from Paraguay. It came here, hidden in cargoes. It was mainly bought by Americans and Argentinians. We sold it to them out of kindness, because at that time, it couldn't be legally imported.
Finally, our tour of the Rambla leads us to the Mercat de la Boqueria. Since it was opened in 1840, this has been the locals' favorite market. Under this great metallic structure, which was built in 1914, there's a dazzlingly colorful selection of seafood, fruit, and vegetables. Near the main entrance of the Boqueria, Juanito runs Barcelona's most famous tapas bar.
My parents started like this. I just took over from them. Now it's my nephew's turn. It's been in the family for generations. The Boqueria is unique. It's the best market in Europe. Nearly all the tourists come to see the Boqueria just to admire this marvelous place. It's a symbol of Barcelona. Like the statue of Columbus or the Sagrada Familia. More than just a market, it's a key part of town. It's an institution. I have all sorts of customers in fashion, politics, art, and all you lot too.
We leave Barcelona behind us now as dusk envelopes once more the ghostly towers of the Sagrada Familia. Norway heads off on the high seas for the south and Lisbon. Whereas the crew of the France was mainly made up of French people, the Norway's 1,000-strong crew comprises over 50 different nationalities. Indeed, the Norway is the only cruise ship which flies the United Nations flag.
If you're in the land, there is a politics. Here, comparing to a land, there is a politics here, but really nice one, friendly. You meet a lot of crew here with a smiley face, and we have really a nice time here, joking each other. And honestly, even up from the officers down to the bottom, we are really called one family.
1700.
Okay, remember.
The skills and qualifications on board a ship like the Norway are incredibly varied. There are, of course, the officers and sailors. As for Antonio, he's in charge of the mooring equipment at the rear of the ship. Catering and services make up the largest proportion of the tasks of the 1,000 crew members. Consider for a moment the number of cabin staff. Waiters, cooks, pastry chiefs, wine waiters, linen maids, barmen, maintenance staff. Not forgetting the nurses, secretaries, musicians, hostesses, hairdressers, sports instructors, activity leaders. Then there's the printer, plumber, electrician, doctor, photographer, and so on and so forth. All ready to meet the needs of 2,000 passengers busy with their vacations.
The future, I would say, for the Norway is bright. It depends, of course, how long can we make money. The reason why she was decommissioned as the France was that they were losing money. Yeah. They couldn't find the right ways to make the money. Yeah. The ship can live a very long time. I mean,
how many years?
Well, when she was built, the French said she was built to last 50 years. But it costs a lot, you know, to renew the systems on board, and that is the question. How long can we keep it going? Because we have to invest all the time in new equipment and so on, the machinery. But the ship itself, if we can just renew it, it will last forever. Forever.
Forever.
Yes.
The chief mechanic takes us on a tour around the heart of the ship and confirms the captain's words. The engines of the France are the most extraordinary and the most reliable he's ever seen. Having been carefully looked after, they have the same design and appearance they had when they slid down the Atlantic slipways. Indeed, the name is still visible in capital letters. When she became the Norway, she lost half of her power in a bid to reduce fuel consumption. The France was capable of 30 knots, but today's Norway cruises along at 18 knots. After the hum of the propeller shaft, we enter the kitchens and discover the bustling maelstrom of activity. It's nearly dinner time. Jovito the busboy swings into action.
Jovito, can you explain in what consists your job?
Okay. This is the job of busboy. It's the job 3 S's. Escarping, separating, and segregating.
Each busboy assists a waiter. They're responsible for the service of several tables in the restaurant.
Javi is a very good guy, no? Fast worker, hard working.
The countdown to the opening of the restaurant continues with mechanical precision. Every day at the same time, when the bread comes out of the oven, the busboys are ready and waiting. Meanwhile, in the restaurant, which is still empty at this time, the roll call for the waiters begins.
Now you have to check the guy like 30 minutes before they open the dining room. So you know who is not here and who is missing. Maybe they oversleep, so you can contact them right away.
Back in the kitchens, despite the imminent rush, the young French chef seems to have the situation under control.
How many people work in the galley of the Norway?
We have a total of 150 people who work in the galley. There are 30 people in the storerooms. In the kitchen where the real cooking goes on, there are 35. We have about 10 bakers, 10 pastry cooks, a half a dozen butchers, and all of these people come from quite different backgrounds. There are about 30 different nationalities working in the galley.
And all of this runs smoothly?
Very well. When you realize we have to provide about 1,200 hot main meals in about half an hour.
No ship can claim to have the same quality and amount of food as the France had. Nevertheless, just like in the olden days, the food is one of the keys to a successful cruise.
In the wake of the Argonauts and Homer, we do not lose our appetite. Everyone on board is delighted. Sometimes mealtimes resemble maritime picnics. Anything goes on board, even gaining a few pounds. The boat won't mind.
After 2 days, the ship has traveled from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic via the Strait of Gibraltar. The Norway is now sailing up the Tagus estuary toward Lisbon.
The river is very, very deep?
Yes. Plenty of water in the middle. If you go out on the side, not enough.
Having taken the Portuguese pilot on board, the Norway continues its journey to Lisbon. She goes past Belém Tower and draws near the bridge of the 25th of April, formerly known as the Bridge of Salazar, where it will berth.
I think it's a wonderful ship. It has so much history involved with it. You know, it's La France. That spirit remains. It's great job.
So we've been to France. We're going to Ireland next, Barcelona, and we even took a train to Italy. So we've seen a lot of places we would otherwise not have been able to see with small children.
And the life on board?
Oh, it's wonderful, and I've never had such delicious food.
Legend attributes Lisbon's birth to Ulysses. It's above all the daughter of the Atlantic and the Tagus. Despite the construction of 2 bridges, the coming and going of ferries is never ending between the 2 banks of the Straw Sea, the name the people of Lisbon give to the widest part of the estuary. This site takes us back 5 centuries into the past when people flocked to the banks of the river Tagus to greet the returning caravels. In the days of the great sea routes, Lisbon was the center of the world. A monument has towered over the Tagus since 1960 to celebrate the father of the great maritime discoveries, King Henry the Navigator.
What was it like in the days of the big convoys, with dozens of caravels, hundreds of boats?
Nós temos para meados do século XV.
In the mid-15th century, a writer and member of a caravel, Fernando Lopez, wrote that 100 caravels on the Tagus was common. These were not just boats setting off to discover the East, but also all the boats that linked Atlantic Europe to Mediterranean Europe and had to stop off in Lisbon to pick up supplies, to let the crew rest, and for repairs. The ships went from Lubeck to Italy, or left Barcelona, bound for the Atlantic French coast.
In the port of Belém, the tiny church where Vasco da Gama went to pray before his great departure in 1497 gave way in 1502 to the Hieronymus, Lisbon's most famous monument. The Hieronymite convent was built in the Gothic style under King Manuel I, and the church now contains the great navigator's tomb. The construction of the Hieronymite convent took almost 100 years. The convent owes its name to the Hieronymite religious order, descendants of the Knights Templars. It was financed with riches from the voyages of discovery, in particular spices. Indeed, it was often said that it had been built from pepper. It featured a multitude of nautical symbols, anchors, caravels, sea creatures, and ropes. The cloisters are an ode to the glory of the great discoveries of yesteryear. One of the most pleasant ways to discover Lisbon is on board one of these colorful trams, which snake their way through the narrow streets of the old quarter.
Do you like the number 28?
Very much.
Why?
It's very hilly, very varied. I really like it.
Wouldn't you prefer to drive one of the new automatic trams?
No. At first I didn't get a chance to. I wasn't allowed, and I'm not interested anymore.
Lisbon is a great metropolis and a historic capital, but some parts of the city have preserved a village-like atmosphere. Built at the turn of the century to link the Baixa with the heights of the Barrio Alto, the San Justa elevator is one of Lisbon's most surprising sights. "32 meters higher up, we discover another side to Lisbon, the multitude of red roofs of the old quarter of the Alfama. The Alfama, the White City, is the historic heart of Lisbon. The Arabs gave it the name Alfama because of its hot water springs. They built palaces there, and the Christians built churches. Destroyed by an earthquake in 1755, the Alfama became what it is today, a popular quarter with a maze of busy, charming, medieval alleyways.
How long have you lived here?
40 years.
40 years. And why? Why here?
To live and work. I like it here. People are friendly to each other. We get along well. We are happy here. We have all we need.
The warm light of dusk falls on Lisbon as the Norway sails off into the distance.
A Torre de Belém é o início, digamos, de percurso.
Belém Tower is the starting point for anyone putting out to sea from the port of Lisbon. It's one of the things that the 16th century sailors must have remembered after they left. And the first thing you see as you enter this magnificent port. It was also the starting point to newly discovered lands like Brazil and India. It was the point of entry for new products, spices and exotic animals, such as lions, rhinoceroses and elephants, and for new plants and foods that would revolutionize Europe's eating habits.
Completamente a dieta alimentar da Europa é momento transformador.
This era was crucial.
Os europeus tomam consciência.
For the first time in their history, Europeans really became aware of the size of the world. People came from all over to see this new geography, brought here thanks to the caravels and the new maps.
Através, digamos, dos navios que chegam com as novas cartas.
The fado was first heard in the warehouses along the Tagus in the 19th century. For a long time, it expressed the tragic destiny of the people of Lisbon. It still represents the soul of a whole country.
The fado is everywhere, even if its roots are in Lisbon. The soul of the fado is right here. People all over our country sing the fado. It's inside us. Being born in Lisbon doesn't make you a fado singer. For instance, I grew up in the district of Alentejo, and yet I'm a fado singer. Fado is a way of life. You don't have to be sad, though. I can be sad, but look like I'm happy. The blues is a state of mind.
As the Norway sails down the Tagus and one sees the reflections of the setting sun on the hull of the longest liner in the world, one cannot help but think with affection of the France, the Normandy, and the golden age of the great ocean liners. The famous blue ribbon was fined from the top of the great mast. 4 days, 3 hours and 14 minutes, record for the crossing of the North Atlantic. The people of New York gathered along the banks of the Hudson and gave an ecstatic welcome to the most beautiful ship in the world. The Normandy was destroyed by a fire in 1942 in the port of New York, and it wasn't until May 11, 1960 that her successor came along. General de Gaulle describes the latest of the French line's ships thus: "The ocean liner France has now put to sea," as she slowly left the slipway number 1 where the Normandy had once been built. When the greatest ocean liner in the world, as she was called, embarked on her first transatlantic voyage on February 3, 1962, it was already too late. Airplanes were already the best and fastest way of crossing the North Atlantic. In 1974, the golden age of ocean liners and the France came to an end. The age of the cruise and the Norway could begin. The France was bought on June 25, 1979 for 70 of World War II and stayed there until 1962. Despite drawing 10.5 meters of water, the Norway casts anchor quite safely. The children in these small boats that have gathered to meet the Norway are in awe of her sleek bows that cut through the water like a knife through butter.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bay of Villefranche.
In the days when members of the bourgeoisie traveled on the first great liners, the French Riviera grew immensely in popularity. The automobile was invented and roads were built, which meant that certain parts of the coasts which were previously inaccessible could now be reached. Leopold II, Princess Helen of Serbia, and many other royal figures came to Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat. Europe's elite built sumptuous palaces here. The Villa Efrus. This century has been paradoxical. There's been huge scientific and technical progress, but so many lives were lost in wars. It's also been a time of ever greater speed. The great ocean liners were a symbol, at least until the late 50s, of a certain art of living and represented a nation's prestige. After the Île-de-France in 1926, the French line launched the Normandy. 313 meters of absolute elegance. Her shape and size were sheer poetry, and her 3 funnels were perfectly proportioned. The overall effect was of immense power. The interior was designed by the greatest artists of the day and is just as stunning. The dining hall, 86 meters long and 8.50 meters high, is as spacious as the Hall of Mirrors in the Versailles Palace. She's not only luxurious, she's fast too. When the Normandy arrived in New York in May 1937 million francs by the Norwegian shipowner Knut Kloster. Having been abandoned for 4 years, the France became the Norway. The Norway was overhauled and refitted from top to bottom and became one of the symbols of cruises to the Caribbean. For the first time since May 1974, the ship's long hull slipped through the waters of the Mediterranean, bringing back memories of her youth 25 years before. This cruise was a double voyage. First of all, a tourist trip to discover Villefranche-sur-Mer, Barcelona, and Lisbon with their rich maritime past. And secondly, an archaeological search for the remains of the old France, whose ghost is said to still haunt the gangways of the Norway. On the first morning, we arrive at Villefranche-sur-Mer. The Norway slowly enters one of the most beautiful harbors in the world. Villefranche Harbor, which is 150 meters deep in places, was for centuries the envy of the kings of Sardinia, who established a port there for their galleys in the 18th century. Later, the American squadrons moved in at the end. Rothschild is one of the finest examples. In grounds of 7 hectares, Beatrice de Rothschild, a collector and philanthropist, had a small Venetian-style palace built, surrounded by 7 themed gardens reminiscent of Italy, Spain, Japan, and so on. At that time, cosmopolitan eclectic styles of architecture sprang up on the Riviera, reflecting the whims of this immensely rich group of people who traveled widely and had a passion for past civilizations. From the gardens, the guests of Beatrice de Rothschild had